The mid to late 16th century saw a positive revolution in Kabbalah, the speculative mystical piety downstream of texts like Sefer Yetzirah, Sefer Bahir, and most especially the positively monumental Sefer Zohar. During this period, Kabbalah of the Safedian school, those mystics located in the Galilean towns around Safed and Meron, the traditional burial site of Shimon Bar Yochai, the central protagonist, of course, of the Sefer Zohar, would introduce new mystical practices and speculations that would transform not only Kabbalah, but Judaism itself. From the Friday evening Kabbalat Shabbat service and its famous hymn Lecha Dodi to Geroshin, or self-imposed mystical exiles, new traditions for the exorcism process of the dead in this case, or Debukim, to spiritually communing with righteous ancestors through mystical pregnancy or Ibor, to new mystical concepts now just thought to be central to Jewish theology. The divine contraction, or tzimtzum, the shattering of the vessels in the process of the restoration of those vessels in Tikkun Olam. This period would see the rise of a school of Kabbalah that is now overwhelmingly recognized simply as Kabbalah, Kabbalah Simplicator, of Rabbi Isaac Luria, primarily represented by his disciple, Chaim Vital. However, while Luria's teachings have come down to us primarily in the editorial nightmare that is the Kitvei Ha'ari of Vital, another Kabbalist would publish ideas within Lurianic Kabbalah much, much earlier. The mysterious Kabbalist Rabbi Israel Sarug would bring together this revolutionary Kabbalah both to Europe and to print earliest in the 1590s, within a generation of Chaim Vital. Further, this variant of the Lurianic Kabbalah would push back the metaphysical clock. Well before the emergence of even the famous sefirot, even before the period of Adam Kadmon, before even the divine act of contraction, or tzimtzum, often held to be the first activity of the otherwise utterly unknowable Ein Sof. Here we find Ein Sof in a state of delight, of sha'ashua, in which the knower, knowledge, and known are united into one auto-erotic ecstasy, which eventually catalyzes that very act of divine contraction, or tzimtzum. Further, the Kabbalah of Sarug also explains the emergence of the garment of light, the malbush, composed from the points of light left over from that primal contraction. That garment, or malbush, will prove central in that it becomes, at least in the Sarugian Kabbalah, it becomes the primordial Torah, the interface between the inner hidden reaches of the divine and the revealed apparent regions of theophany and revelation. Let's explore these elements of the Sarugian Kabbalah, variant of the Lurianic Kabbalah, the primordial delight, and the primeval Torah as the Sephirah Da'at. Make sure to subscribe for weekly explorations of topics here in esoteric history, and if you'd like to support the work of providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content like this, then I'd hope you consider supporting my Patreon or taking a look at some of the merch that we have on the channel. But if you're new to the study of esotericism, also make sure to check out my study guide, which sort of orients you to the world of the academic study of Western esotericism. And if you really want to dive in, you can pick up some actual historical antiquarian volumes of the occult and the mystical over at my bookstore, Esoterica Rare Books. You can find the links to all that down in the pinned comment and over in the description and wherever else you put links like that. But now let's go way back before in the beginning God created, to the primordial delight and the mysterious emergence of the Sefirah Da'at as nothing less than the primordial Torah. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. The Mishnah at Chagiga 2:1 famously issues this injunction, Whoever looks at four matters, it would have better for him to have never entered the world at all. Anyone who reflects upon what is above the firmament and what is below the earth and what was before creation and what will come after the end of the world. And anyone who has no concern for the honor of his maker and who inquires into these matters not permitted for him to inquire into, deserves to have never come into the world. In effect, the Mishnah has a kind of moratorium on idle speculation about what we frankly just can't ever know anything about. Rather than prompts for some kind of existential philosophical speculation, asking questions about what came before creation or what happens after the end of the world, or frankly what happens after we die, is disregarded as worse than idle chatter. It's damnable, baseless nonsense for which no one has any good answers. And while I suspect that some of that speculative allergy was inspired by the explosion of apocalyptic literature and religiosity, some of which frankly led to complete social catastrophe around the time of the composition of the Mishnah, I think they were suffering from something of an apocalyptic hangover. Such speculation for them became worse than just damnable. It was deemed that such speculators didn't even merit to come into the world to be damned in the first place. They simply deserved to have never been born at all. Lucky them. But that apocalyptic hangover lifted. Indeed, Jewish apocalypticism endured right through that prohibition on the Mishnah, and Jewish mysticism began a period of intense speculation on the origins of creation, a theme actually very much taken over from that scorned apocalyptic literature at this point. This Jewish mystical obsession about the origin of the cosmos could, I think, rightly be contrasted with the inverse Christian obsession about the end of the cosmos. But among the many things Kabbalah is, it is an enduring, sustained, and even obsessive interest into the liminal infinitude of the instance between the utter, unknowable primordial infinity, or Ein Sof, and the moment of revelation, or theophany, in which the cosmos comes into existence and knowledge about the divine becomes possible. Of course, given that the gap between the transcendent infinite and the immanent finitude is itself at least potentially infinite, probably infinite, that minimal moment of infinitude can be expanded, deepened, and speculated about, well, infinitely, regardless of that pesky Mishnaic prohibition. That's on no more clear display than on the now canonical mystical speculations of Kabbalah that have grown up around the teachings of Rabbi Isaac Luria, or the Ari, or the Arizal. Now, a few warnings for this episode. This is not going to be a primer on Lurianic Kabbalah. I'm just going to assume that you are aware of the basics of the mythology there. But the most basic summary is that the infinite light of Ein Sof contracted some of that light into a near empty void, known as a Tehiru, in a process or act known as tzimtzum. Divine light flowed into that void, shaping Adam Kadmon, the primordial human. From the eyes, nose, and mouth of Adam Kadmon flowed further light, which formed vessels. And those vessels, however, were too weak to hold the divine light flowing down into them, and the top three cracked, and the lower seven shattered and fell down into the void. That Shevirat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels, allowed evil to come into the cosmos, forged in the fires of Mount Din, or the Sefirot of Gevurah, such that the task of Kabbalah is to metaphysically repair the world, the process of Tikkun Olam, through scrupulously following the Torah, along with some more esoteric tikkunim, or reparations. Now, that's only the most simplistic, generic telling of the myth. It's akin to the planetary model of the atoms that we teach middle schoolers, which is like totally wrong. And honestly, this episode is going to be focusing on the primordial period well before the formation of Adam Kadmon. That is to say, well before even the period of the sefirot, and even before the period of the tzimtzum. But I'm already beginning to hear I hear you Kabbalists out there already beginning to grumble. Doesn't the Arizal make it abundantly clear that nothing can be known before the formation of Adam Kadmon, and even the nature of tzimtzum, or divine contraction, is utterly speculative? Yes. Yes, that's true. In fact, it's one of the many heresies of the Shabbatians, may their memory be erased, to have taken tzimtzum literally. That is the belief of tzimtzum kapushto, literal physical tzimtzum, is a profound heretical misunderstanding of Luria, who always had such descriptions of that process with his kivyachol, as if, or as it were, in the form of a subjunctification for just such speculation about tzimtzum. Well, for one, I have bad news for a lot of people out there who have learned Kabbalah and are basically taught to believe in some version, actually, of tzimtzum kapushto. It's just out there. It's probably the most widely taught and held Kabbalistic heresy in the world. And yes, Sarug is going to push speculation back before tzimtzum, though with a little bit of help from Rabbi Moses Cordovero, my hero, the Ramak. So just go out there and have fun telling everyone that Ramak is Apikoros. And also, if I hear somebody out there talking about Ramak is Apikoros, we're going to have words. It brings out the southerner in me. But finally, as a kind of warning, I just want to make a point clear that I made just a moment ago. Luria is oft to use the subjunctive language of kivyachol, as if, as it were, because these primordial epochs are simply beyond all human comprehension at any level. Thus, the language of space and time, before and after, high and low, even basic metaphysical processes like cause and effect, subject and object, or just emanation versus creation must all be taken as profoundly provisional and subjunctivized as something like metaphors or allegories, a kind of speculative myth language for beings and processes totally beyond human conceptualization. So hear that subjunctive quality all the time, that kivyachol, as if it were attached to every single speculative statement from here on out. So let's peer back before that primordial act of divine contraction, that primordial tzimtzum, kivyachol. To understand how Sarug develops his speculations around this pre-tzimtzum epoch, we have to understand how he leans very strongly on the Kabbalah as it was developed by the Ramak, or Rabbi Moses Cordovero. In general, before Luria made his way to Safed, teaching there only for a couple of years and writing very little, frankly, before his death in 1572, the leading and most important systematizer of Kabbalah had been the Ramak, who had actually passed a couple of years previously in 1570. Now, Cordovero and his father-in-law, Shlomo Alkabetz, the composer of that great hymn, Lecha Dodi, were absolute titans in the development of the Safedian Kabbalistic revolution. But it was truly the Ramak who had achieved something that seems impossible to me. A complete philosophical and mystical system bringing together virtually every other strain of previous Kabbalistic literature and speculation into one system. That Kabbalistic system was, for a sadly brief period of time anyway, recognized as just Kabbalah. In fact, and this is just my one Kabbalistic hot take of my life, I still prefer the system of the Ramak way more than the Baroque mystical meanderings of Isaac Luria and his disciples. But that's just me, and I'm sure I'll be condemned to cherem for that, but come at me, bro. Regardless, Luria, according to legend at least, rode into Safed on that day that the Cordovero died, and he actually saw in the funeral procession of the Ramak a pillar of fire following the funeral procession of Cordovero. It was as if the divine that had led the Israelites through the desert had returned, now to follow in the funeral procession of the Ramak, according to Luria. The Ramak was going to be a hard act to follow, and any Kabbalistic system that was to come later had to find some way of reconciling the Ramak system into any new system. And Luria and his disciples, I have to admit, they did that, and they did that to spectacular effect. the Kabbalah of Luria, at least in that name, would win all the days to become more or less simply Kabbalah, as most people, not me, know it today. But now enter the mysterious Rabbi Yisrael Sarug, an early adopter of the Lurianic system and the first to publish his ideas starting in the 1590s there in Italy, all the while the manuscripts from Chaim Vital were being hidden, stolen, copied, remixed, transmitted, and who knows, God knows, in manuscript. They only finally appear in print in Koretz in 1785 or so. Don Carr has a fantastic essay called Which Lurianic Kabbalah, which is absolutely the best of history of this tortured development of Lurianic Kabbalah in English. Well worth a read. Don Carr has fantastic bibliographies and stuff among books. You should check his work out. While the Kabbalah of Sarug and Vital are closely related, again, as a representative of the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria, there is a particularly Cordoveran element, in the Kabbalah of Israel Sarug. And this might very well represent the very early period where the Kabbalah of the Ramak was still being reconciled and absorbed into the system of Luria. But this is an especially odd fit because the Lurianic school just flatly rejects, as I mentioned earlier, that one, there is any divine activity prior to tzimtzum, or that two, any knowledge of the divine prior to the epoch of Adam Kadmon was possible given the fact that that was the epoch of Ein Sof, which is totally and utterly unrevealed. It's the utter transcendence of Ein Sof and tzimtzum. All we can know about tzimtzum is purely speculative, and you can't take any of it literally. Remember, that's the heresy, tzimtzum kapushto. But in a sense, that's precisely what Sarug is going to be able to do, because he's going to be leaning on the Kabbalistic system of the Ramak. But what does that look like actually? Well, in the system of the Ramak, the period before the emanation of the sefirot is actually marked by a totally concealed, it is Ein Sof after all, but a totally concealed inner dynamism of divine self-knowledge, where knower, known, and knowledge itself are completely and utterly unified as one subject-object process. This united, dynamic self-knowledge is characterized by what the Ramak terms the divine delight. Again, it's a process of delight well before any emanation of the sefirot, but that delight, or the sha'ashua, was such that, and to quote the Ramak, Ein Sof was alone and delighting, mishta'ashua, in the comprehension of his own essence, or his own atzmuto. Notice there's a distinction here between the divine and the divine essence, or the atzmuto. This, however, is an absolute unity of self-knowing that is driven by a transcendent compassion also submerged in Ein Sof. You'll recognize some of these forces as what will become eventually the differentiated sefirot, but now as undifferentiated primordial potencies submerged in the hidden unity of Ein Sof. And this beneficent compassion seeks to extend beyond the reaches of the divine self. But from that divine self-consciousness flows a non-strict mathematical identity between knower, knowledge, and known, such that the non-self-sameness of the divine, which is going to become the divine name, becomes differentiated and revealed, so to speak, as the primordial sephira of Keter. Notice I said revealed, so to speak, because Keter is never really revealed, which is, again, a purely logical but not ontological ground of revelation. Again, Keter is never really revealed. That the divine is taking delight, sha'ashua, in the divine's own essence also already implies a disjunction between the divine and the self-knowledge of the divine as divine essence, as atzmut, such that that disjunction, once submerged in the infinite sea of Ein Sof, emerges discreetly as the first true metaphysical entity, the sefira of Chokhmah, divine wisdom, God's self-knowledge. Though, as we'll see in a moment, we're going to complicate this a good bit, so don't rest on the idea that it's Chokhmah at first implicator, even though you've probably been told that at some point. But already what's key in all of this is that for the Ramak, before the emergence of the sefirot, or anything else for that matter, Ein Sof was always already undergoing the process of the divine delight, or the sha'ashua, and it was that activity, as it were, that catalyzes the emergence of the sefirot and everything else, leaving Ein Sof fundamentally unchanged as the fundamentally unaltered origin of creation as change. But let's complicate that further. While the sphere of Chokhmah is simply the sha'ashua of the divine knowledge at a conceptual level, it is merely conceptually sufficient for all further divine revelation, or the shifa, the flowing out, which coalesces into the further system of the sefirot. But it isn't capable of self-revelation. And of course, Keter isn't capable of inducing such a revelation because Keter is ultimately a kind of transcendence. Recall that Keter is Ein, no thing, to Yesh, the some-thingness of the lower sefirot, and a no thing cannot reveal any of the some things. And this is again where the sha'ashua, the delight, catalyzes the system as the mysterious sephira of da'at, or cognition, active knowing as opposed to the knownness, or having known of Chokhmah. For the Ramak, it is precisely the activity of the divine delight, the sha'ashua of the knower, the known, and the knowledge triad, which are activated by the inner recesses of the divine will in Keter, and that will of active goodness itself, another dimension of the sha'ashua. Here, from within the hidden dimension of the divine will in Keter emerges a similar invisible extension as divine knowledge in the form of the quasi-sephira da'at, which extends left and right to form chokhmah, divine wisdom as self-knowledge, and binah, discrete, quantitative knowledge versus the qualitative wisdom of chokhmah. A quasi-sephira in that vis-a-vis Keter da'at isn't considered, but since Keter cannot be considered, da'at is the divine will made manifest or revealed as such. Keter and da'at represent the groundless ground of the divine will. And with this triad, the primal delight, or sha'ashua, which was once and eternally will be the united dynamism of knower, knowledge, and known, hidden deep within the inner recesses of Ein Sof, emerged as the revealed self-consciousness of the divine, such that all that is and will be is unified in precisely this self-consciousness. Thus, an inner esoteric delight of Ein Sof, but also the revealed ecstatic going out of itself, the ecstatic sha'ashua or delight in the revealed self-knowledge, such that all instances of knower, knowledge, and what is known participates in this ongoing ontological divine revelation. And yes, all of this talk of delight and self-knowing very much has a kind of intellectual and yet simultaneously auto-erotic tenor in the original text. So there's a lot going on here that I'm not going to talk about to not get demonetized. But I think you can read between the lines if you figure out auto-eroticism and self-knowledge. Hamavin Yavin. That's the Ramak. Israel Sarug is going to do something rather interesting with the concept of the divine delight, the sha'ashua. He's going to use it to explain something that Isaac Luria never does because Isaac Luria can't. Why did the divine contract? Or why did tzimtzum happen at all? As much as it did happen at all. Again, why is there something rather than nothing, in a sense? The answer for Sarug, and an answer that's never found in Chaim Vital, is that the sha'ashua itself catalyzed tzimtzum. Yeah, sha'ashua, the divine delight, catalyzes tzimtzum. Sarug tells us that Ein Sof took delight in his essence, mishta'asher ba'atzmo, the same language that was employed by the Ramak, but rather than catalyzing an instance of shifa, or emanation, it initiated a singular creative moment in the divine will, whereby an outside is forged in relation to the inner recesses of Ein Sof. Sometimes this is an initial drop of semen, just to keep that line going. That interface is the primordial Torah in the form of the garment or malbush of the residual light left over through the tzimtzum. This is the reshimu within the void of the tehiru following tzimtzum. In a sense, Sarug's move allows him to maintain an interesting position over and against the more Neoplatonic style of emanationism that we see in the Ramak, that of the strict creation from nothing, yesh me'ayin, from Maimonides. Bug or feature? Well, that's up for you to decide, but it is a kind of creation out of nothing in Sarug. Further, Sarug also considers this initial creative moment brought on by the sha'ashua to contain the forces of finitude, constriction, quantification, and restriction. The Torah, after all, is a set of instructions, which are by definition restrictions and creating thus finitude. Given such conditions, Sarug actually links the revelation of the primordial Torah further with the restrictions which are associated with the sefirot of Gevurah or Din, the roots of evil or the roots of Din, the Lurianic system, but also with the sefirot of Malchut, the primordial desire of the divine to act as caretaker or custodian in sovereign power over what is, all of this. Thus, the divine delight, the sha'ashua, triggers several complementary but different simultaneous creative expressions of the divine will at various layers of the sephirotic reality. Again, as a discrete voluntary impulses from deep within Ein Sof. For the Ramak, if you're wondering, Din or judgment just exists within the undifferentiated field of the sephirotic forces submerged within Ein Sof, such that it only becomes a potential root of evil precisely in the process of differentiation, whereby Chesed is no longer able to mitigate it, as it was able in the sort of differentiated field of Ein Sof, and Din/Gevurah come into its own, thus grounding the existence of evil in the Kabbalistic system. And this is a typical difference between the Ramak and Sarug. For the Ramak, the sha'ashua is a primordial process which always already catalyzes the flowing forth of the sephirotic system, whereas for Sarug, it is a discrete, quantized, pulsating event, an expression of the divine will that he sometimes compares to a flicker of a flame or an outburst of divine laughter, which is my favorite version of his description, but also sometimes as ripple upon an otherwise perfectly still body of water. Of course, there are other elements that make the Sarugian variant of the Lurianic Kabbalah distinct from the dominant species of Kabbalah downstream from Chaim Vital. The most prominent element, of course, being that of the Malbush, or the garment of light, that forms from the residual light, the Rishimu, from within the void left behind in the process of tzimtzum. This is the Rishimu, the remnants within the Tehiru, the mostly empty void of the tzimtzum, which becomes the matrix from which the primal Torah is generated, and the lower part of which is folded up, so to speak, to become the region of the sephirotic emanation. It becomes a kind of womb within the tzimtzum. But that's in the period after tzimtzum and a little late for this episode, temporally speaking. Yes, the void left behind in which the sefirot will eventually emanate is just too late a period in cosmic history for this episode, but it is a great topic for a future episode. I'm definitely going to come back to describe the Malbush and how it generates the Torah and how that's very different, for instance, in Cordovero. But I think this is a fascinating glimpse into an important period in the history of the development of Kabbalah. Here we see the Cordoveran conception of the primordial divine light, or sha'ashua, being grafted onto the Lurianic system in one of its early articulations, that of the Sarugian Kabbalah. And it generates a kind of activity or process that we learned actually existed alongside the utter unknowability of Ein Sof, and somehow exists before the moments of emanation and before the moments of tzimtzum even. And it's a bit of a delight to know that it was delight all along. Finally, this is all interesting because while the concept of the sha'ashua isn't really taught as part of the Lurianic myth, elements of it actually would survive in certain Kabbalistic modalities, especially in the Hasidic movement. I think, in fact, in the Chabad movement, these ideas still persist in interesting and important ways. Unfortunately, nearly all of the information on the Ramak, along with Sarug and Sarugian Kabbalah, by such amazing scholars as Ronit Moroz and Liebs and Zach and Ben Shlomo and Boaz Hus and so many other, they all remain in Hebrew. And indeed, I have to be honest here, the magic works of all the major thinkers, including Sarug and the Ramak, all also remain in Hebrew, and frankly, they're all going to remain in Hebrew. It's very unlikely a lot of this stuff is going to get translated anytime soon. They're just so technical that even when I do consult texts that are in translations, like those, for instance, I don't know, of Yehuda Ashlag, they're just ridiculous. because every third word is just some technical term transliterated from Hebrew or Aramaic. I'm just reading these thinking, why is this even translated if every third word is just a transliterated technical Hebrew word? But Sharon Shatil's article in the Review of Rabbinical Judaism is a very helpful introduction, the only one I know of English, to the relationship of the Sarugian Kabbalah to both the Ramak and through the development of the Kabbalah in Isaac Luria and Chaim Vital and their descendants. Though I'll be honest, even the article by Shatil is pretty technical and requires a pretty serious background in Kabbalah more generally, but it's the best we got in English. Though I'll probably circle back to the primordial Torah in both the Ramak and the distinctly Sarugian concept of the garment of light, the Malbush. So that and definitely more Kabbalah to come. Until then, thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.